They sold Amara before sunrise because they thought separation would make her mother weak. They were wrong. By the time the wagon left the plantation road, Amara had already understood the trap. If they caught the daughter, they believed the mother would come back. So Amara made a colder choice. She would not run from the hunt. She would become the reason the hunt went the wrong way. They brought her out before the first full light. The yard was still wet from night air. The ground held the prints of wagons, boots, and bare feet pressed into the same dirt, one over the other, as if the plantation had been built on movement but allowed none of it to lead anywhere. Amara Bell stood near the side of the wagon with her wrists tied in front of her. She was young, but not a child, old enough to understand what a sale meant, old enough to know that when a white man said a person was being moved, he meant erased from the hands that loved them. No one said the real reason out loud at first. They said she had become troublesome. They said she asked too many questions. They said she had been seen whispering near the washhouse after dark. But the truth was narrower and uglier. The owner suspected her mother, Amara Bell, had been helping children disappear. Not grown men, not armed rebels, children. Small bodies moved under shawls, little feet taught to step on stones instead of mud. Names practiced in whispers, roots hidden inside ordinary chores. A broken fence rail, a hollow stump, a dry creek bed behind the pine line. Mabel had been watched for weeks. The owner could not prove it. Not enough to expose the whole route. Not enough to know who else was involved. But he knew where to press. He knew the old method. When they could not find the path, they would seize the heart. So they sold Amara. Not because she was worth more elsewhere, not because the plantation no longer needed her labor. They sold her because they believed her mother could be controlled through pain. Amara saw Mabel standing near the edge of the quarters. Two women held her by the arms, not because she was fighting, but because everyone expected her to break. She did not. She stood still. Her face looked emptied out, but her eyes stayed fixed on Amara. That silence was the first act of resistance. The men mistook it for defeat. The wagon driver checked the rope. The overseer counted coins into a small leather pouch. A second guard leaned against the fence with a rifle resting in the crook of his arm. None of them hurried. They wanted the leaving to be seen. Punishment worked better with witnesses. Amara was pushed toward the wagon step. Her foot touched the wood. She did not climb yet. For 1 second, mother and daughter looked directly at each other. No goodbye, no promise. No begging, just a look sharp enough to carry instructions. Mabel's lips barely moved. Remember the creek. The guard heard the sound but not the meaning. He struck the side of the wagon and told Amara to get in. She did. The wheels began to turn. The plantation house stayed behind them, pale and still, pretending innocence in the morning light. Behind it, the quarters remained low and dark. Children watched from doorways. One of them, a boy no older than 7, tried to step forward. A woman pulled him back before the overseer saw. Amara did not turn around again. That mattered. A person who looks back too much gives away where the wound is. The road outran between cotton fields first, then past a line of trees where the soil dipped and held water after rain. The wagon moved slowly because one of the horses had a weak left leg. The men complained about it. They complained about the mud. They complained about the distance to the next plantation. They did not know Amara was listening to every word. She counted the turns. She watched the guards' habits. The one beside her spat to the right every few minutes. The driver kept looking at the horse's leg. The man riding behind them stayed too far back when the road narrowed. The rope around her wrists had been tied for fear, not skill, tight enough to hurt, not tight enough to hold forever. But Amara did not move yet. An escape too early would pull the hunt close to the plantation. Too late, and she would be beyond the woods, she knew. She needed the right place. A place where men on horses would think they had the advantage. A place where dogs could be brought in quickly. A place visible enough for panic. She needed them to believe they were choosing the chase. Just past the low creek crossing, the wagon slowed. The weak horse stumbled. The driver cursed and pulled the reins hard. One wheel sank into the soft edge of the road. The guard beside Amara turned his head toward the sound. The rider behind came forward, annoyed. That was the first opening. Amara moved. Not wildly, not like the terrified girl they expected. She dropped low, slipped one bound hand under the loose side rail, and threw her weight toward the ditch. Her shoulder hit mud. Her knees struck roots. The guard grabbed at her dress and caught only a torn strip of cloth. She rolled once, came up, and ran straight into the trees. For 3 seconds, no one understood what had happened. Then the shouting began. The driver yelled her name. The guard fired into the air, not at her, because he wanted sound more than aim. The rider turned his horse too sharply and nearly lost balance. Somewhere behind them, a dog began barking from a farm track. Amara ran hard enough to be seen. That was important. She broke through a patch of cane and snapped it at chest height. She stepped into the wettest mud instead of the dry ridge beside it. She pressed one palm against pale bark as she passed, leaving a clear mark. When a thorn caught her skirt, she did not free it carefully. She ripped away, leaving fabric behind. Every sign said panic. Every sign said weakness. Every sign was chosen. The men saw the trail and laughed. "She won't last an hour," one said. They believed what they needed to believe. That was the easiest part of the plan. Men who owned people were trained to misread them. They could recognize labor, obedience, fear. They could not recognize strategy when it came from someone they had decided was beneath them. Amara gave them the story they wanted. A frightened runaway, a careless girl, a body fleeing without a mind. Behind her, the hunt organized itself exactly as she had hoped. The wagon was left at the road. A boy was sent back for dogs. 2 mounted men pushed into the tree line. The overseer shouted orders. No one in those first minutes looked back toward the plantation road. No one asked why the trail was so obvious. No one asked why Amara had not taken the dry ground. No one asked why she kept angling west, away from the known crossings, away from the places a person would actually use to escape. Because in their minds, Amara was not leading. She was only running. Back at the plantation, Mabel waited until the sound of the wagon had fully disappeared. Then she moved, not toward her daughter, away from her. That was the price of the plan. 6 children were already hidden near the wash pit, covered under sacks and old cloth. One girl held a toddler's mouth gently against her shoulder to keep him quiet. Another child had ash rubbed along the hem of his clothes to dull the scent. Their faces were still, too still for children. Mabel looked at each of them and made a small motion with her hand. They rose without speaking. They did not take the main path. They did not run. Running leaves proof. Panic breaks branches. Fear makes noise. Amara had taught them that. Mabel had repeated it until even the youngest understood. Step on stone when there is stone. Step in water when there is water. Do not touch leaves above the waist. Do not cry when dogs bark. Do not look back unless someone falls. And if someone falls, lift them fast. They moved behind the smokehouse, past the broken fence rail, and into the narrow strip of trees that field hands used when carrying water. From there, the ground sloped toward the old creek bed. This was the road no one was watching, because Amara had made herself the road everyone could see. In the woods, she heard the dogs join the chase. The sound came thin at first, then stronger. She stopped near a muddy bank, bent down, and dragged both feet through the wet soil, making the prints deeper. Then she crossed the creek at the shallowest point, turned back, crossed again, and stepped through a patch of crushed mint growing near the water, scent over scent, print over print. A false trail laid with care. She looked behind her, not in fear, to confirm they were still coming. A rider broke through the trees on the far side and shouted, Amara let him see the edge of her dress before she vanished again. She did not smile. This was not a game. Every mistake she pretended to make cost strength. Every extra step burned time from her own body. But every minute mattered. Every minute placed more distance between the dogs and Mabel. By noon, the men were deep enough into the woods to lose sight of the road. By afternoon, their horses were sweating. By evening, they had followed Amara into ground that bent south, away from the creek route where the children had gone. That night, Amara hid under a fallen pine and listened to them curse in the dark. She could hear one man blame the dogs, another blamed the mud. The overseer blamed everyone. No one blamed the girl. Not yet. That was why she was still winning. But the body has its own truth. Her wrists were raw from the rope. Her feet throbbed. Hunger tightened her stomach. She had swallowed creek water too quickly and felt sick from it. The night insects gathered around her face. She dared not slap them away. A lantern moved between the trees. Then another. The men were closer than before. Amara pressed her back into the wet ground and held still. For a moment she saw her mother's face as it had looked that morning. Not broken. Not safe. Just carrying the unbearable knowledge that love sometimes means obeying the sacrifice you want to stop. Amara closed her eyes. She remembered the owner's voice. "Catch the daughter and the mother will crawl back on her own." That sentence had been meant as a threat. Amara had turned it into evidence. Evidence of the crime, evidence of the method, evidence that the people who called themselves masters understood family only as a chain they could pull. So she had taken hold of the chain first. She would decide where it led. Before dawn, she rose again. She stepped into the open just long enough for a dog to catch the scent. Then she ran west, deeper into the wrong woods, away from the creek bed, away from her mother, away from the children who had to become invisible before sunrise. The hunters saw her and shouted. The chase began again, and still none of them understood the simplest fact of that morning. Amara was not trying to disappear. She was making sure everyone else could. If you're listening from the United States, Jamaica, Haiti, the Caribbean, Africa, or anywhere this history still speaks to your bloodline, comment where you're watching from. And tell me this, would you have run for yourself or stayed behind so someone you loved could escape? By the second morning, the hunt had stopped looking like a quick recovery and started looking like a failure. The men had expected a frightened girl to collapse within sight of the road. They expected hunger to slow her, fear to expose her, and the dogs to finish what the riders could not. That was how the system had taught them to think. It told them that a person who ran was already half defeated, but Amara was still ahead, not far ahead, never far enough to disappear completely. That was the detail none of them understood. She gave them sound when they needed sound, a branch snapping in the wrong place, a splash through shallow water, a flash of brown cloth between trunks, then silence long enough to make them push harder. The hunters followed the signs because the signs were easy, too easy. A broken cane stalk leaned toward the west, a heel print cut deep into mud, a scrap of fabric hung on a thorn bush at shoulder height. One rider dismounted, pulled it free, and held it up. "Still running scared," he said. The overseer took the cloth and looked at it. He wanted to believe that. Belief made his job simpler. A scared girl could be dragged back. A scared girl could be used. A scared girl could make a mother surrender. He shoved the cloth into his coat pocket and ordered the dogs forward. The dogs pulled hard at first. Their noses moved over the ground, then lifted toward the damp air. The scent was strong. Too strong. It ran through mud, over crushed leaves, across exposed roots, then broke suddenly at the creek. The first dog entered the water. The second circled. The third barked toward the bank Amara had already crossed twice. The handler cursed and pulled them back into line. They thought the creek had confused the animals. It had not. Amara had crossed there on purpose, then returned, then crossed again. She had dragged both feet through the bank and pressed her hands into the mud. She had made the place loud with her presence, not because she was careless, but because she understood that dogs followed what men valued: the most obvious trail, the strongest scent, the nearest body. A few miles east of that confusion, Mabel and the children moved through ground that held almost nothing. They did not travel as a crowd. Mabel had split them into pairs with short gaps between each pair. The oldest girl carried the toddler. The two boys moved behind her, stepping where she stepped. Mabel came last, using a pine branch to soften the few prints that appeared in damp soil. There was no heroic speed in this escape. That kind of story would be false. They were slow, frightened, hungry. One child kept trembling so hard his teeth clicked. Mabel stopped twice to press her hand against his mouth and whisper into his ear until he could breathe without sound. Every delay was dangerous. Every sound could become evidence. They reached the dry creek bed near midday. The bed looked empty, but Mabel knew where the stones lay under the leaves. Amara had shown her months before, pretending to gather kindling while marking the route with small axe no overseer would notice. A bent nail under a root, 3 stones stacked behind a stump, a strip of old blue thread tied low where only someone looking for it would see. This was not luck. This was preparation carried out under surveillance. This was intelligence hidden inside ordinary labor. The children crossed one at a time. The toddler woke halfway across and began to whimper. The girl holding him froze. Mabel came close, took a small piece of corn cake from her sleeve, and placed it against the child's mouth. Not enough to feed him, enough to stop the sound. Then she looked back. The forest behind them seemed still, but stillness was not safety. Mabel knew the hunt was somewhere west of them. She knew her daughter was keeping it there. She also knew that a plan built on sacrifice can succeed and still leave a mother destroyed. One of the boys whispered, "Is Amara coming?" Mabel did not answer immediately. The question had no safe answer. A lie would be mercy for only a few minutes. The truth would make the boy cry. So she gave him instruction instead. "Step where I step." He lowered his eyes and obeyed. That was how terror moved through that forest. Not in screams, in obedience. In small children learning that survival required silence before they had learned to read. Back in the western woods, Amara changed the pattern. She stopped leaving cloth. She stopped breaking branches at shoulder height. For nearly an hour, she gave the hunters less, only a partial print near a wet patch. A bent fern, a disturbed line of ants along a log. The men slowed. The overseer grew angry. "Spread out," he ordered Shad. That was another mistake. 3 riders moved apart, each trying to recover her trail. One went south toward heavy brush. One pushed north into a stand of pine. The handler stayed with the dogs near the creek. Separation made them louder. It made them slower. It made every man believe the others had lost what he might find. Amara watched from behind a fallen tree. She had not vanished. She was less than 50 yards away. Her breathing was shallow. Her wrists had swollen around the rope burns. She had cut one ankle on stone during the night and wrapped it with a strip torn from her underskirt. Blood had soaked through once, then dried dark. She knew better than to let the dogs catch that scent for long. She picked up a handful of wet clay and rubbed it over the cut. It stung. She did not make a sound. Then she crawled backward through low brush, careful not to shake the leaves above her. When she reached a patch of exposed mud, she stood and placed one clear footprint facing south. Only one. Then she stepped onto a log, walked its length, and dropped down on the other side where dry pine needles covered the ground. Minutes later, one rider found the single print. He called the others. The hunt turned south. Amara waited until they committed to the direction. Then she moved west again, keeping low, making just enough noise for the dogs to recover her after the men had already wasted distance. This was not random evasion. It was controlled misdirection. Each false clue forced the hunters to spend strength. Each correction pushed them farther from the true road. Each delay gave Mabel a little more distance. The cruel machinery of the plantation depended on speed. Owners counted on fast pursuit, fast punishment, fast fear spreading through the quarters before anyone else tried to run. Amara attacked that speed. She turned the hunt into hours, then into a day, then into another. By late afternoon, the consequences reached the plantation. The owner, Nathaniel Crow, stood on the front steps waiting for news that did not come. He had expected Amara back by breakfast. By noon, he expected the dogs to have found her. By sundown, he began to understand that something had gone wrong. A house servant was sent to the quarters to check on Mabel. She was gone, so were the children. The discovery did not arrive as drama. It arrived as inventory, one empty sleeping pallet. Then another. A missing shawl, a missing tin cup, a child's wooden button left near the wash pit. The owner saw absence before he understood escape. That was the moral structure of the place. Human beings disappeared, and the first language used to describe it was loss of property. Crow struck the porch rail with his cane and demanded names. No one gave him any. The people in the quarters looked down, not because they knew nothing, but because they knew enough to survive the question. He ordered 2 men to ride after the hunting party and tell the overseer to turn back at once. But turning back was no longer simple. Amara had made sure of that. By the time the messengers reached the first creek crossing, they found churned mud, overlapping tracks, dog prints, horse prints, and Amara's repeated marks running in conflicting directions. The road into the western woods no longer looked like pursuit. It looked like a storm had passed through on foot. One messenger dismounted and stared at the ground. "Which way?" the other asked. There was no clean answer. That was the first visible proof of Amara's success. Not freedom, not safety, confusion. Confusion was enough. In the older escape route, Mabel reached the second marker just before dusk, a hollow sycamore split by lightning years before. Inside the hollow was a small cloth bundle, dried corn, a strip of smoked meat, a needle, 2 buttons. Not much, but it meant someone had reached the place before them and left help. Mabel divided the food into pieces too small to satisfy anyone. The oldest girl refused hers at first and tried to give it to the toddler. Mabel closed the girl's hand around it. "You walk, you eat," she said. No softness, no speech about hope. Survival had no room for decoration. They ate standing up. Then Mabel made them change formation. The boys would go first now, because their lighter steps left less mark in the dry stretch ahead. The girl with the toddler would move in the center. Mabel would remain behind. One child asked again, quieter this time, "Will she find us?" Mabel looked toward the west. Somewhere beyond the trees, dogs barked. Mabel's face changed, but only for a second. "She already has," she said. The child did not understand. Mabel did. Amara had found them time. That was the only rescue possible from where she stood. Night came heavy. The forest cooled. Sound traveled farther. Amara used that to her advantage. She let the hunters hear her near a ridge, then slipped down before they reached it. She knocked loose a stone and sent it rolling into a gully. 2 men followed the sound and lost 20 minutes climbing back out. She moved through a shallow pool and left the bank torn up behind her. The dogs found the water and circled again, agitated. The handler pulled them hard. He was starting to lose confidence. Animals could be blamed only so long before men had to consider the intelligence of the person they were hunting. The older hunter, Josiah Rusk, said nothing for most of the evening. He had tracked runaways before. He knew panic. Panic scattered signs. Panic doubled back without purpose. Panic chose easy ground, even when easy ground exposed the body. This was different. The girl's trail had rhythm, too much rhythm. She gave them evidence when they were about to lose her. She withheld it when they moved too fast. She bent their direction without ever getting far enough away to end the chase. Rusk crouched near a patch of mud where Amara's foot had pressed deep beside a fallen branch. He touched the edge of the print. It was clean, fresh, almost placed. The overseer came up behind him. "What is it?" Rusk did not answer at first. Then he looked toward the dark trees where Amara had disappeared. "She wants us on her," he said. The overseer frowned. Rusk stood slowly. "This trail is too good." That was the moment the hunt began to turn against itself, not because the men had become wise, because the evidence had become too clear to ignore. And somewhere ahead, Amara heard their voices lower. She knew suspicion had entered the chase. That made it more dangerous. It also meant the plan had worked long enough to be seen. She leaned against a tree, closed one hand around the bark, and forced herself to remain standing. Her body wanted to stop. Her mind counted distance. By now, Mabel should have crossed the dry bed. By now, the children should have reached the hollow sycamore. By now, if they had not been caught, they were beyond the first patrol ring. Amara inhaled once. Then she stepped deliberately into a moonlit strip of ground where the hunters could see her outline. A shout rose behind her. The dogs surged. She ran again, not toward safety, but toward the next wrong direction. And behind her, men with guns and horses followed a girl they still believed they were hunting, while every step proved they had already been led. By the third day, the hunt had a different sound, less shouting, more silence between orders, less laughter from the riders. More attention paid to the ground. Suspicion had entered them, and suspicion changed the rhythm. Men who believed they were chasing fear moved fast. Men who feared they were being led moved carefully. That care cost them time. Amara had forced them into the one condition the plantation feared most: delay. The older hunter, Josiah Rusk, took command without being given command. He did not shout like the overseer. He watched. He crouched. He checked the direction of crushed grass and the depth of each print. He studied places where Amara had stepped too hard, then places where she had vanished too cleanly. At a bend in the creek, he stopped the party. The dogs pulled toward the bank, then circled back toward a patch of sedge. The handler tried to force them forward. Rusk raised one hand. "Leave them!" The handler froze. Rusk knelt and touched the mud. There were marks everywhere now, bare feet. Boots, hooves, dog paws, old prints cut by fresh ones. A clear trail had become a field of competing evidence. This was the damage Amara had done. A plantation hunt depended on certainty. One scent, one direction, one body to seize and display. Amara had turned that certainty into a swamp of signs. Every mark accused the hunters of their own arrogance. They had followed everything because they believed she knew nothing. The overseer, Caleb Wren, stepped beside Rusk. "Find the girl." Rusk did not look up. "She gave herself to us before we got here." Wren's face tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means she has been choosing the ground." Wren grabbed him by the shoulder and forced him to stand. "She is tired. She is hungry. She is alone." Rusk looked toward the trees. "No, she is buying time." That sentence changed the air. The men understood it at different speeds. The handler understood first and looked back toward the road. One rider cursed under his breath. Another checked the powder in his weapon, as if the realization itself had made the forest more dangerous. Caleb Wren understood last because pride stood in the way. He had built his authority on the belief that fear was simple. Apply pressure, get obedience. Remove a daughter, break a mother. Send dogs, recover the body. But the girl had not behaved like property. She had behaved like a witness who knew the crime and had arranged the scene against him. Wren turned on the men. "Backtrack." No one moved. He said it again, louder. "Backtrack now." Rusk shook his head. "That is what she wants you thinking about." Wren stared at him. Rusk pointed toward the creek, then toward the ridge, then toward the mud flats behind them. She has crossed herself over too many times. We go back now, we lose the dogs. We push forward, we may catch her, but the old road is gone to us either way. There it was, the consequence, not a theory, not a feeling, a tactical defeat. Amara had not escaped them. She had damaged their ability to return. Wren's hand moved toward the whip at his belt, then stopped. Even he understood that striking a hunter would not recover the trail. Violence was the language he trusted most, but the ground did not answer to it. Ahead, Amara heard only fragments. Backtrack. Too late. Buying time. She was hidden in a low pocket behind tangled roots. Less than 100 yards away. She could not see them clearly, but she heard the change. Their voices had lowered. Their confidence had broken into argument. That was new. Until then, they had followed her as if her capture was inevitable. Now they were considering what her choices meant. That made them slower, but it also made them more dangerous. Once a captor understands he has been humiliated, he stops trying only to recover property. He begins trying to restore power. Amara knew the difference. She pulled herself deeper into the brush and checked the small strip of cloth around her ankle. It was stiff with dried blood and clay. If she left too much blood, the dogs would regain certainty. If she moved too slowly, the men would widen around her. If she vanished completely, they might abandon the chase and return east. She still needed to be found. But not yet. To the east, Mabel had reached the old pine road. It was not a road in the legal sense. No wagon had used it in years. It was a narrow corridor left by timber work, nearly hidden under needles and low growth. It ran north for half a mile before dropping toward a marshy basin. Beyond that basin was the river route. The children were weaker now. The toddler had stopped crying, which frightened Mabel more than noise would have. Silence in a small child could mean obedience. It could also mean exhaustion. She took him from the girl and carried him herself, though her arms already shook. The oldest boy had begun to limp. He tried to hide it, but the left foot dragged slightly every fourth step. Mabel saw it and stopped the group. No one argued. She knelt, removed his worn shoe, and found the problem. A thorn pushed deep into the sole of his foot. Not dramatic, not large, enough to slow them. Enough to make him leave a heavier print. Enough to ruin everything if ignored. She pulled it free with her fingers. The boy's face twisted, but he made no sound. That restraint should never be mistaken for calm. It was what slavery demanded even from children, pain without evidence. Mabel tore a strip from the inside hem of her dress and wrapped the foot. Then she placed his shoe back on and held his face between both hands. "You step light, even when it hurts." He nodded. They moved again. Behind them, the plantation's response was expanding. Nathaniel Crow had sent riders to neighboring properties, not with the full truth. Men like Crow rarely reported failure honestly. He said there had been a theft. He said several enslaved people had been misled. He said one girl had attacked a guard and fled. He did not say that a mother had disappeared while his entire hunting party chased a false trail. That detail would make him smaller in the eyes of other men, and men who built kingdoms out of stolen labor feared humiliation almost as much as loss. By afternoon, 2 new riders arrived near the first road crossing. They were supposed to support Wren and turn the hunt back east. Instead, they found wrecked tracks, confused dogs, and no clear connection to the escape route. One of them asked the obvious question, "Where did the mother go?" No one answered because the answer was already becoming unbearable. She had gone where they were not looking. The institution that claimed total control had failed in the oldest way. It had watched the person it feared least and missed the person who mattered most. In the western woods, Wren changed his method. He ordered the men to stop following every sign and start closing space. 2 riders would move wide on the left. Rusk would stay near the creek. The dogs would hold the center. Wren would press forward and force Amara toward the marsh basin ahead. It was a containment plan. Rusk did not like it, but he saw the logic. If they could not trust the trail, they would use terrain, push her where the ground narrowed, make her choose between open water and armed men. For the first time, the hunters were no longer taking Amara's path exactly as she gave it. That was the danger she had been expecting. She heard them separate again, but this time the separation had discipline. No careless shouting, no isolated rider chasing a single print. The dogs were held back, not allowed to surge at every scent. Amara crawled through a stand of young pine and reached a slope overlooking the marsh basin. She stopped. This ground was worse than she had hoped, and better than she feared. Wide patches of dark water, knee-deep mud near the edges, grass high enough to hide a child, but not a grown rider. Fallen logs crossing parts of the basin, beyond it a ridge that bent north. If she crossed wrong, she would sink. If she crossed right, she could force the hunters to dismount. She did not need to outrun horses. She needed to make horses useless. Amara stepped out deliberately where the dogs could see movement. A bark cut through the trees, then another. Wren shouted, "There!" Amara ran down the slope. She did not choose the firm bank. She entered the marsh at an angle, stepping where the grass grew thickest. Mud closed around her ankles. She grabbed a branch and pulled herself forward. Behind her, the first horse reached the edge and refused the ground. The rider cursed and tried to force it. The animal backed hard. A second rider dismounted. The handler brought the dogs forward, but the dogs hesitated at the water, noses moving across old scent, new scent, marsh rot, and stirred mud. The basin swallowed certainty. Amara pushed deeper. Her body nearly failed halfway across. One knee went down, mud climbed to her thigh. She caught a root, pulled, and felt something tear in her shoulder. The pain was sharp, but not disabling. She held still for one breath, then moved again. Behind her, Wren entered the marsh on foot. That mattered. He had come off his horse. Every yard he crossed now cost him. Every step slowed him. Every man following him had to commit his own body to the ground she had chosen. This was the reversal Amara had been building toward, not victory in the clean sense. There was nothing clean about it, but for the first time, the men were being dragged through the consequences of their own pursuit. Rusk watched from the bank. He saw Amara turn her head once, just enough to check whether Wren had followed. That small movement confirmed everything. "She wanted this ground," he said. No one listened. Wren was already in too deep. At the far edge of the basin, Amara reached a fallen cypress and pulled herself behind it. She could have kept going north for a short distance. Not far, not enough to escape, but enough to vanish for a few more minutes. Instead, she did something colder. She stood. Fully visible. Mud covered her dress. Her hair had come loose. Her hands were shaking from exhaustion. She looked like defeat from a distance. That was the point. Wren saw her and pushed harder. The dogs barked behind him. The men entered the marsh, one by one. And while the hunting party committed itself to the slowest ground in the county, Mabel and the children reached the first reed line near the river. There was no celebration, only another problem. The boatman was not there. Mabel brought the children down behind the reeds and made them crouch. The river moved black and steady beyond them. On the far side stood trees that looked no different from the trees behind them, but everyone understood the difference. The far side was not safety. It was distance, and distance was the first form of mercy. The oldest girl whispered, "Where is he?" Mabel listened. No oars, no signal, no low whistle from the bank. For the first time since leaving the plantation, the plan met a gap Amara could not fill. Mabel had to decide whether to wait, move along the bank, or hide until night deepened. Waiting could save them. Waiting could trap them. The children looked at her as if she held the future in her hands. She did not. She held only the next decision. She pointed to a cluster of roots above the waterline. Under there, now. The children crawled into the cover. Mabel covered the toddler's feet with her skirt to hide the pale soles in the fading light. Then she moved back through the reeds and broke several stems in the opposite direction, creating the impression that someone had passed downstream. Not Amara's kind of false trail, Mabel's. The mother had learned too. Back in the marsh, Amara saw Wren closing in, 20 yards. Then 15. His face was no longer controlled. The humiliation had reached him fully now. He had not come to understand the crime. He had come to punish the evidence of his failure. Amara backed up one step, then another, until her heel touched the fallen cypress. There was nowhere clean to go. Rusk reached the edge behind Wren and called out, "Hold, she's got you off the ridge." Wren ignored him. Amara lowered herself behind the cypress and slipped through a narrow gap between the trunk and the water. For a few seconds, she vanished. Wren lunged forward, expecting to seize her. His boots sank deep. He fell to one knee. Not injured, not trapped forever, but stopped. Stopped long enough for the men behind him to bunch together in the worst part of the marsh. Stopped long enough for the dogs to tangle their lines. Stopped long enough for Amara to emerge 10 yards to his left, breathing hard but still moving. Rusk saw it clearly then. This was not just delay, it was placement. She was putting them where return would be slowest. He looked east, though the plantation was far beyond sight. He understood that by now the mother and children were not simply ahead, they were possibly beyond reach. That recognition did not soften him. Men like Rusk could admire skill and still serve cruelty. But it made him honest for 1 second. "She's already cost us the road," he said. Wren heard him this time. His face went still. The words landed harder than insult. The road was not just a path. It was control. It was the line back to the plantation, back to the mother, back to the children, back to the owner's authority. Amara had cost them that. At the river, Mabel heard the signal at last. Not a whistle, 3 soft taps against wood. She turned toward the reeds. A narrow boat slid out of darkness, guided by a man whose face remained hidden under a worn hat. He did not speak. He only held the boat steady with one hand and counted the children with his eyes. Mabel moved them fast. One child, then another. The limping boy nearly slipped. The boatman caught him under the arm and placed him down without a word. The toddler was passed last. Mabel stepped in after them, but before sitting, she looked back into the trees. No one could see Amara from there. No one could hear the marsh. Still, Mabel knew what had bought them this crossing. The boatman pushed off. The river took them slowly at first, then carried them into the darker current. Behind them, the reeds closed. In the marsh, Amara stumbled onto firmer ground, but her strength was almost gone. The hunters were still behind her, closer now, angrier, less easily fooled. She had gained the one thing she needed most: time. But time had a cost, and the bill was coming due. She turned once more toward the sound of the man fighting through the mud. Then she moved north, away from the river, away from the crossing, away from every person she had just helped save. She did not know whether Mabel had reached the boat. She did not know whether the children had stayed silent. She did not know whether the route had held. She only knew the hunters were still with her. And as long as they were with her, they were not with them. By the 4th morning, the chase had stopped being a pursuit and become a contest of endurance. Amara no longer had the strength to shape every step. She could still choose direction, still choose ground, still choose when to show herself, but the body she was using as bait had begun to fail. Her left foot dragged more often. Her breathing came rougher. When she reached for branches, her fingers sometimes missed. The mud had dried in hard patches against her skin. Her dress was torn at the knees. The rope burns at her wrists had darkened and swollen. The hunters saw it. That was the danger. A weakening body gives captors confidence. It makes them careless in one way and cruel in another. They stop respecting the strategy and begin waiting for collapse. Caleb Wren saw her stumble near the edge of a narrow ravine and raised one hand to halt the men behind him. "No more running blind," he said. His voice was lower now. The rage had cooled into method. That was worse. He ordered the riders to spread in a half circle and push north. The dogs were held back until the last moment. Josiah Rusk stayed near the center, studying the slope ahead. They had learned enough not to follow every sign. They had learned enough to fear the obvious trail. Amara watched them from a screen of brush and understood the change immediately. They were no longer chasing her path. They were closing her body. That was the next stage of the violence. When men could not read the ground, they read exhaustion. When they could not recover the mother, they would recover the daughter. They had failed at control, so they would take the nearest proof they still possessed power. Amara pushed herself away from the brush and moved toward higher ground. Not fast. Fast was no longer possible. The ravine ahead was shallow at first, then dropped into a narrow run of stone and packed clay. Rainwater had cut through it years before, leaving exposed roots along both sides. It was not deep enough to kill a horse, not wide enough to stop a determined man, but it could slow them. It could force a line. It could make guns less useful and dogs harder to manage. She entered it without hesitation. The men saw her go down between the banks. Wren pointed. There, close both ends. This was the first time the hunters had chosen well. 2 riders moved along the rim. Another circled west. Rusk descended behind Wren, rifle held low, eyes on the ground rather than on Amara's back. The ravine turned into a channel of sound. Boots scraped, dogs strained. A stone broke loose under someone's heel and clattered forward. Amara heard every movement amplified against the clay walls. She could not disappear here. She had not entered to disappear. She entered to make them commit. At the far bend, the ravine split. One side narrowed into a crawl beneath roots. The other opened toward a patch of cane and standing water. A person escaping for herself would take the narrow root path. It was hidden, small, difficult for armed men. Amara looked at it once. Then she took the open way. Rusk saw the choice. His mouth tightened. "She passed the better cover," he said. Wren ignored him again, but the words struck the men behind him. They were beginning to hate Rusk's observations because each one gave the girl more intelligence than they wanted her to have. Amara stepped into the cane and broke it loudly, not at random. The sound pulled the right side rider down from the rim. He forced his way through too quickly, cursing as the cane whipped against his face. The dogs dragged the handler toward the noise. Wren followed. For several minutes, the hunt collapsed back into its old mistake. Sound. Motion. Anger. Amara used the cane to cross toward the standing water, then turned sharply along a dry strip hidden beneath the grass. She did not gain much distance, but she shifted them again, not west now, not south, but deeper north, away from the ridge that would have returned them fastest toward the plantation roads. Every yard still mattered. Every wrong turn still served Mabel. Across the river, Mabel and the children were no longer in the same county's reach, but they were not safe. The boatman had landed them before dawn at a low bank beneath sycamore roots. He gave no name. He asked for none. He pointed toward a narrow path and said only, "When the sun lifts, stay under trees." Then he pushed back into the current and vanished into the gray water. Mabel counted the children again on the bank. 6. The number held. That was the closest thing to mercy the morning offered. The toddler slept against the oldest girl's shoulder. The limping boy stood with his weight on one foot. The smallest girl stared back toward the river, as if expecting Amara to rise out of the water and join them. Mabel saw it and looked away first. There are moments when hope becomes dangerous because it asks the body to stop moving. Mabel did not allow it. She led them inland. The land beyond the river was different but not free. There were farms, roads, men who asked questions, men who did not need legal authority to become dangerous. Every tree line could hide help or betrayal. Every cabin might offer bread or a rope. The escape had entered its second truth. Leaving the plantation was not the same as reaching freedom. Amara had bought them distance. Mabel now had to turn distance into survival. They reached a collapsed corn crib near mid-morning. Mabel hid the children inside and covered the opening with loose boards. She told them not to move until she returned. The oldest girl grabbed her sleeve. "Don't leave." Mabel looked at the child's hand, then at the woods. "I'm not leaving. I'm looking." She moved alone toward a smoke trail she had seen beyond the trees, not straight toward it. Never straight. She circled, watched, waited. At the edge of a small clearing, she saw a cabin with 2 shirts drying outside and a split-rail fence in poor repair. No dogs, no horses tied near the door. No white cloth marker at the window, which Amara had once said meant danger on this route. Still, Mabel did not step out immediately. A black man came from behind the cabin carrying a bucket. He stopped before she spoke, as if he had felt eyes on him. Mabel lifted both hands where he could see them. "I have children," she said. The man did not ask from where. That was a kind of answer. He set the bucket down. "How many?" "6. His face changed only slightly. The number was not small. He looked past her toward the trees. "Dogs? Not on us." That was not the same as no, he understood. "Bring them after dark," he said. "Not before." Mabel wanted to ask whether a young woman had crossed the river behind them. She wanted to say Amara's name. She did not. Names were evidence. Names could be beaten out of people. Names could become maps. She nodded once and returned to the corn crib. Back in the cane, Amara's strength broke for the first time in front of them. Her foot caught on a hidden root. She fell hard onto both hands. The impact sent pain through her wrists. She tried to rise and failed once. The dogs saw it and surged. The handlers shouted and pulled them back, but the sound changed the men. They had seen weakness become visible. They closed faster. Amara forced herself up. She did not run now. She moved. There was no grace in it. No beauty. The body under pursuit is not a symbol to itself. It is breath, pain, calculation, and refusal. She reached a patch of low water and stepped in. The water was not deep enough to hide her trail, but it cooled the mud on her legs and gave her one more tool. She moved through it for 20 yards, then climbed onto a flat rock and stood still. The hunters stopped at the bank. For a moment, both sides saw each other clearly. No brush, no fog. No false trail between them. Amara on the rock, thin with exhaustion, breathing hard. Wren in the mud, coat torn, face drawn tight with rage. Rusk behind him, watching not the girl's face, but the ground around her. The dogs pulled against their leads. Wren raised his rifle but did not fire. A dead girl would not bring Mabel back. A wounded girl might slow everything. He needed her alive because his cruelty still depended on using love as leverage. That was the accusation at the center of the scene. They did not only hunt bodies, they hunted relationships, motherhood, sisterhood, memory. Attachment, anything that proved the enslaved were human, became a handle for punishment. Wren lowered the rifle. "Come out," he said. Amara said nothing. "You hear me?" She looked at him, then past him, toward the direction they had come from. The gesture was small, but Wren understood it as defiance. He stepped into the water. Rusk caught his arm. "Wait." Wren pulled free. Rusk pointed at the rock. "She stopped where we can see her. Ask why." Wren's jaw tightened. Amara took one step backward off the rock and dropped into a deeper pocket of water behind it. For a second she vanished to the waist. Then she pulled herself up the opposite side and stumbled into a stand of cypress knees. The men rushed forward. The first dog hit the water too hard and lost footing. The second tangled its lead around a root. The handler fell to one knee. Wren crossed, but slower than he wanted. Rusk went around the rock instead of over it and found what Amara had used, a narrow shelf hidden under the waterline. She had not stopped because she was cornered. She had stopped to make them choose the wrong crossing. By then she had gained only a few minutes. But minutes were all she had left to give. At dusk, Mabel brought the children to the cabin. The man had cleared a space beneath the floorboards. Not comfortable, not clean. Enough. His wife gave each child a small cup of water and half a piece of bread. She did not speak while handing it over. Her silence was practiced. The house carried the discipline of people who had helped before and understood the cost. Mabel stayed near the door, listening. The wife looked at her. "You wait for someone?" Mabel did not answer. The woman understood anyway. "They don't always come behind us," she said. The sentence was not cruel, it was mercy stripped of softness. Mabel looked down at her hands. There was dirt under every nail. One nail had split. Her palms were marked from branches and riverbank roots. None of it hurt, as much as standing still. "She made them follow her," Mabel said. The wife's face lowered. Then she nodded once. Not pity, recognition. Because every escape route had names that never reached the end. People who turned back, people who stayed. People who made noise in one direction so silence could move in another. The history was full of them, though the records preferred numbers. Night settled around the cabin. The children slept under the boards. Mabel remained awake. Across the river and miles away, Amara could no longer keep ahead cleanly. Her false trails had weakened. Her choices had narrowed. The hunters had learned the shape of her strategy, if not the full purpose. They knew now that she wanted distance from the plantation road. They knew she preferred bad ground. They knew she showed herself when they hesitated. So Wren gave a new order. No more chasing her signs. Chase her breathing. It was a brutal instruction, and it worked. The men stopped watching only the mud. They listened for snapped breath. For water disturbed too recently, for birds lifting from brush, for the sound of a body that could no longer move without consequence. Near midnight, Amara hid inside the hollow of a burned-out tree. She had squeezed herself into it sideways, one shoulder pressed against charred wood, knees drawn tight. The darkness inside smelled of ash and insects. The dogs passed once, then again. She held her breath until her chest burned. A lantern came close. Rusk's boots stopped outside the hollow. He did not see her at first. He saw the mud on the roots. A smear where a hand had slipped, a small mark of blood diluted by water. This was not the same kind of discovery as before. Not a cloth scrap, not a footprint placed for them. This was involuntary evidence, the body betraying the plan. Rusk lifted the lantern. Amara looked back at him from inside the burned tree. Neither spoke. For 1 second the old hunter saw the whole thing without needing explanation. The false trail, the wasted road, the missing mother, the river that might already have taken the children beyond reach. Then Wren arrived behind him. "What is it?" Rusk did not answer fast enough. Wren shoved him aside and raised the lantern. The light found Amara's face. The chase ended in silence first, then with hands reaching into the hollow, pulling her out, binding her wrists again, tighter this time. She did not fight hard. There was no strength left for the kind of struggle they expected. But when Wren leaned close and said, "Your mother will come back now," Amara looked at him with a calm that unsettled even the men holding her. She had been caught, but the words did not land as power. They landed too late. Because somewhere beyond the river, 6 children were sleeping under floorboards, and Amara Bell was still awake, still listening, still alive. Amara lowered her eyes only once. Not in surrender, in calculation. She had to know what they knew. She had to measure their anger. She had to survive long enough for the truth to remain hidden. Wren mistook that lowered gaze for defeat. That was his last comfort. The girl he had captured was exhausted, bound, and surrounded, but the reason she had run was already out of his hands. They bound Amara at the wrists and made her walk before them. Not because they trusted her legs. Her legs were nearly gone. They made her walk because display mattered. A captured runaway dragged through the woods told one story. A captured girl forced to stand told another. Caleb Wren needed the men to see her upright, controlled, return to the shape of obedience. It was a lie, but power often begins by staging lies in public. The rope cut into the swelling already left from the first binding. Amara kept her hands still. Moving them would only tighten the knot. She had learned that pain was sometimes made worse by the instinct to fight it. Wren walked close enough to watch her face. He wanted signs, fear, begging. The first crack, anything he could carry back to Nathaniel Crow and call victory. He saw none. That angered him more than escape had. The men moved slowly through the black timber. The dogs were tired now, heads low, tongues hanging. 2 horses had been left behind near the marsh edge because the ground had damaged their legs. One rider limped from a fall. Another had lost his hat and carried a long scratch across his cheek where Cain had cut him. These were small injuries. Nothing equal to the crime they served, but they mattered as evidence. The hunt had cost them. Not enough to make them innocent, enough to expose that control was not as absolute as they claimed. Josiah Rusk walked behind Amara, quieter than the others. He had seen many runaways captured. He knew the usual look after seizure. Shock, collapse, desperate bargaining, sometimes a numb silence that came from the body trying to leave itself. Amara's silence was different. It was alert. She listened when the men spoke. She measured direction by the slope under her feet. She noticed when they turned east. She noticed when they missed the easier return trail and were forced to cut south to find firmer ground. Rusk noticed her noticing. That unsettled him. A person in chains still thinking strategically offended the entire purpose of chains. Near midday they reached the creek where the first confusion had begun. The place looked worse in daylight. Mud churned into ridges. Dog tracks crossed boot tracks. Horse prints broke through older bare footprints. Water had washed out the edges of every mark that once seemed clean. Wren stopped and forced Amara to face the bank. "Look at it," he said. She looked. He wanted confession from the ground. He wanted her to see proof that he had followed her, found her, beaten her plan, but the ground gave the opposite testimony. The trail did not point to Mabel. It did not point to the children. It did not even point cleanly back toward the plantation. It was a damaged field of false decisions. Amara had not hidden the escape route by removing evidence. She had buried it under too much evidence. That was the brilliance of it. In a system obsessed with tracking, counting, naming, owning, and recording, Amara had created disorder with her own body. She had made herself into the visible record and erased everyone else behind it. Rusk crouched at the bank. Wren snapped, "What now?" Rusk took a long time to answer. "Dogs can't work this." The handler looked away. He already knew. Wren's mouth hardened. "They worked enough." "They worked her," Rusk said, "not the others." No one spoke for several seconds. "There." The hidden failure spoken plainly, "not the others." The words moved through the men like a draft under a door. They had caught Amara. But the plural still stood outside their hands. The others remained a question, and every hour made that question harder to answer. Wren grabbed Amara by the arm and turned her toward him. Where did she go? Amara did not ask who. That would have been a lie too obvious to respect. She looked at the creek instead. Wren shook her once, not enough to break bone, enough to announce ownership to the men watching. "Where is your mother?" Amara's eyes came back to his. "Gone." It was the first word she had given him since capture. Small, exact, more damaging than any speech. Ren struck her across the face with the back of his hand. The blow turned her head but did not drop her. The men looked away at different speeds. Rusk did not move. The handler pulled the dogs back, as if distance from the act could make him less part of it. Amara tasted blood, but the narration should not linger there. The point is not the injury. The point is the function of it. Violence was being used to replace knowledge. Ren could not find the mother, so he punished the daughter for knowing distance existed. He leaned closer. "She'll come back for you." Amara swallowed once. "No." That word was quieter than the first. It did more damage, because Ren heard certainty in it, not hope, not prayer, certainty. He pushed her forward again. They marched east. By late afternoon, the plantation began receiving its own consequences. Nathaniel Crow had ordered every cabin searched. Bedding was overturned, cooking pots emptied, loose boards pried up, cornmeal scattered across floors. Women were questioned separately, then together, then separately again. The method was familiar: isolate, threaten, compare answers, punish silence, reward betrayal. But there was no route to give. Mabel had compartmentalized the escape. Amara knew the false trail. Mabel knew the river path. The children knew only the next step. The boatman knew only his crossing. The cabin beyond the river knew only the number of people brought at night. This was not disorder. It was discipline. The plantation called enslaved people ignorant while surviving every day on the intelligence it tried to destroy. Routes were memorized. Signals were hidden in chores. Warnings moved through songs, laundry lines, food scraps, ash marks, and pauses in conversation. A whole counter system lived under the owner's eyes, because human beings under watch learned to make privacy out of fragments. Crow found no confession that could repair his loss. He found absence, and absence frightened him. The empty quarters had become an accusation. A missing child's cup on the floor, a sleeping mat without a body, a small print near the wash pit softened by dust. These things proved what his ledgers denied. The people he counted had plans beyond him. When the first messenger returned from the western trail without Mabel, Crow struck him in front of the house. "Where are they?" The man had no answer. That failure traveled faster than any official notice. By dusk, everyone on the plantation understood two facts. Amara had been caught and Mabel had not. Fear and awe moved together. No one celebrated openly. Celebration would have been suicidal, but silence changed texture. People worked with their heads lowered, yet their hands moved differently. A woman at the well pressed her fingers once against the rim of the bucket. An old man near the stable coughed twice and looked toward the tree line. A girl sweeping the back steps paused when Crow passed, then continued as if nothing had happened. The plantation was listening to itself. Ren returned after nightfall. He came in dirty, angry, and short of men. The dogs were worn out. The horses looked worse. Amara walked between two guards, wrists tied, face swollen on one side but eyes clear. Crow came down from the porch. He did not ask first if she was alive. He asked, "Where is Mabel?" Ren's silence answered before his mouth did. Crow looked at Amara. The owner had expected to see the tool that would bring the mother back. Instead, he saw the evidence that the tool had already been used against him. He stepped closer. "You cost me time." Amara said nothing. "You cost me property." Still nothing. Crow lowered his voice. "You think she won't come back when she hears what I do to you?" The yard went still. The threat was designed for witnesses, not only to frighten Amara, but to send the message through every cabin. Love would be punished, attachment would be weaponized, family would be made unsafe. That was one of slavery's most deliberate cruelties. It did not merely separate families, it used the fear of separation as a method of governance. Amara looked at the quarters, not at Crow, at the people watching from the shadows. Then she looked back at him. "She won't hear you." Crow's face changed. It was not the words alone, it was the tense. Not she will not come, not she would never. Amara had said she would not hear, too far, too removed, beyond the reach of his voice. Crow understood the insult inside the fact. He ordered her taken to the smokehouse, not the jail shed near the stables where men could watch her, not the quarters where others might reach her. The smokehouse sat behind the main yard, with one small window too high to climb through and a door thick enough to hold a bar. They put her inside without food. A guard stayed outside. That night, Crow sent riders in 3 directions: North Road, River Road, Old Mill Road. He sent descriptions of Mabel and the children to men who lived on other plantations. He offered payment for information. He ordered patrols to watch ferries, roads, churches, free black neighborhoods, and river crossings. It sounded decisive. It was already late. Because every system of pursuit depends on time, and Amara had stolen the first and most valuable part of it. Across the river, the children were moved from under the cabin floor after midnight. The man who had taken them in led them through a rear field one by one. His wife stayed behind to disturb the dirt near the front of the cabin, making it appear that no group had passed through the back. She scattered chicken feed over the children's marks. By morning, birds would do the rest. Mabel carried the toddler again. The limping boy leaned on the oldest girl. They moved toward a wagon hidden in a tree break, where sacks of turnips had been stacked along the sides. The children climbed beneath a false layer of straw. Mabel hesitated before getting in. The cabin woman touched her arm. "If they caught her, they'll use her name." Mabel's face tightened. "I know. They'll say she called for you. I know. They'll say she needs you." Mabel looked toward the road behind them for the first time. Her control nearly broke. Not loudly, just a tightening around the mouth, a tremor in the jaw. The cost of escape had reached the part of her that no strategy could protect. Then she climbed into the wagon, because Amara had not suffered to make her turn back. The wagon moved before dawn, slow enough to look ordinary. Vegetables for market. That was the disguise. 6 children hidden under food, grown by hands like theirs. A mother crouched beside them. A driver who knew not to speak. A route that would split again before noon. No single person carried the whole secret. That was how survival moved. In fragments. In the smokehouse, Amara sat against the wall and listened to the plantation wake. A rooster. A bucket dropped near the well. Footsteps near the back path. A woman coughing. The bar outside the door shifting when the guard leaned against it. Her body hurt everywhere now, but pain had become background. What mattered was information. No alarm before dawn, no riders returning early. No shouting from the road, no dogs sent back out in a panic. That meant they had not found Mabel in the night. Amara closed her eyes. For the first time since the sale, she allowed herself to picture the river. Not as beauty, as distance, as black water holding a boat, as reeds closing behind it, as a child's breathing muffled under a shawl, as her mother's hand counting heads in the dark. 6. If the number held, the plan still lived. Morning brought Crow. The smokehouse door opened and hard light cut across the dirt floor. He stood outside, refusing to step fully into the cramped room, as if proximity to Amara's suffering could stain him. Wren stood behind him. Crow studied her. "You will tell us the route." Amara lifted her head slowly. "There isn't one now." Crow's eyes narrowed. That was not defiance for performance. It was the truth. The route had existed yesterday. It had been footsteps, signals, timing, river passage, a boat, a cabin, a wagon. By morning it had broken into pieces and moved on. You could not beat a completed crossing out of someone who had never been allowed to own anything, but had learned to protect time. Crow stepped closer. "Every road ends somewhere." Amara looked at him. Not if you reach it too late. Wren moved, but Crow raised a hand to stop him. There was calculation in the owner's face now. He finally saw that punishment alone would not recover what he had lost. He needed a public reversal. He needed Mabel to hear. He needed the quarters to see Amara used as warning. He needed the story rewritten before it spread as victory. So he ordered a bell rung, not the dinner bell, the yard bell, the one used when all labor was to stop and every person was to assemble. The sound traveled across the plantation in hard iron waves. People came from fields, washhouse, stable, kitchen, and quarters. They gathered in the yard with the caution of those who understood. Spectacle could turn lethal without warning. Amara was brought out. She stood because 2 guards held her up. Crow faced the crowd. He did not announce that Mabel had escaped. He said there had been deception. He said wicked influences had led children astray. He said Amara had been recovered and would answer for it. The crowd remained silent. But silence is not always submission. Sometimes it is a container, a place where truth is kept until it can survive being spoken. Crow turned toward Amara. Tell them what happens to those who run. He expected her to lower her head. He expected fear to complete the performance. Instead, Amara looked across the yard, past the overseer, past the guards, past the owner's porch, toward the quarters where Mabel had stood. Before sunrise days earlier, her voice was rough but steady. They get farther when you chase the wrong one. The words struck the yard and stayed there. No one moved. Crow's face went white with fury. Wren seized her arm, but the damage had already been done. Not because the line was loud, because everyone understood it. The entire plantation had heard what Crow tried to hide. They had caught Amara. They had not caught the reason she ran, and now the story no longer belonged only to the men who hunted her. They brought Amara back into the yard at sunrise because Crow needed the plantation to witness control being restored. That was the performance he wanted. The runaway caught. The daughter returned. The mother expected to break. The children presumed recoverable, but the performance was already corrupted. Everyone in the yard had heard Amara's words the day before. They had heard the truth strike through Crow's announcement. They had heard that the hunt had gone the wrong way because Amara had made it go the wrong way. No punishment could fully erase that once it had entered the quarters. Power can force silence. It cannot always force belief. Amara stood near the center of the yard with 2 guards beside her. Her body leaned slightly forward from exhaustion, but she did not collapse. Her face showed the cost of the chase. Her dress was mud-stiff at the hem. Her hands were tied again in front of her. She had been given no chance to wash, and that too was part of the display. Crow wanted her to look ruined. He wanted the others to see what running did, but the image betrayed him. She did not look like proof of failure. She looked like proof that the hunt had required 3 days, dogs, horses, armed men, and still returned with only one person. The wrong victory. Crow stood on the porch steps with Caleb Wren below him. Wren looked more dangerous now than during the chase. In the woods, his anger had been scattered by terrain, mud, and confusion. Here in the yard, he had structure again. Guards, bell, porch, owner, audience. Plantation violence always preferred an audience. Crow lifted one hand and the yard went still. "You all see what comes of deceit," he said. No one answered. "You see what comes of running." Still nothing. Amara watched the quarters, not the porch. She saw women standing with their hands folded, men with their eyes lowered. Children held behind skirts. None of them moved openly. None of them could. But they were looking at her the way people look at a message they are trying to memorize before it is taken away. Crow continued speaking, but the words no longer mattered. He spoke of order, theft, duty, punishment. He used the language of law because men like him needed law to dress what violence had built. But the facts stood in the yard without his permission. Mabel was not there. The 6 children were not there. The dogs had not found them. The riders had not brought them back. The mother had not crawled home. Crow turned toward Amara. "Tell them where she went." Amara remained silent. Wren stepped close, but Crow held him back. He wanted the answer public. He wanted surrender spoken before witnesses. A broken body was useful, but a broken voice was better. "Tell them," Crow repeated. Crow. Amara lifted her head. For a moment the yard seemed to wait with her. She did not give a speech. She did not plead. She did not perform bravery for comfort. She only said what the owner most feared was true. "She crossed before you knew she was gone." The words were plain. That made them worse. A murmur moved through the yard before fear swallowed it. Crow's face hardened. He looked toward Wren, and that was enough. Wren seized Amara's arm and pulled her toward the smokehouse again, but the damage had already moved. A fact spoken in public cannot be returned to the mouth. By noon, Crow's riders had begun returning from the roads. One from the North Road, nothing. One from the Old Mill Road, nothing. One from the ferry line, a set of wagon tracks too common to follow. 3 farms searched, no one found. One man reported that a patrol had questioned a farmer across the river. The farmer had seen a wagon before dawn carrying vegetables toward market. He had not stopped it. He had no reason to stop it. That answer infuriated Crow because it contained no confession, only ordinary movement. Ordinary movement was how the escape had survived. No grand procession. No dramatic crossing in daylight. No single heroic road. Just fragments, a boat, a cabin, a wagon, a false layer of straw. People who knew when not to ask names. Crow wanted a single route to attack. There was none. By afternoon, he sent men farther out. They rode hard, but the search had entered the stage where motion became theater. Every hour expanded the possible distance. Every road split into other roads. Every farm track offered a new question. Mabel and the children had become not uncatchable, but unlocatable. That distinction mattered. They were still in danger. The law was against them. Patrols were against them. Hunger was against them. The entire architecture of the region existed to return people like them to bondage. But Amara had denied the system its most valuable advantage, immediate pursuit. She had taken the first hours and buried them in the wrong woods. Across the river, the wagon carrying Mabel and the children reached a market road just after morning traffic began. That was deliberate. Too early and the road would be empty enough to notice them. Too late and patrols might already be warned. In the flow of carts, produce, livestock, and dust, one more wagon could disappear into the ordinary. The children stayed under the straw. One of them began to cough. Mabel placed her hand over his mouth, not hard, just firm enough to turn the sound into breath. The driver did not look back. He kept his eyes forward and complained loudly to a passing farmer about turnip prices. It was a performance of boredom. Boredom saved lives that morning. At a crossroads, the wagon stopped beside a man repairing a fence. The driver climbed down and pretended to tighten a wheel pin. The fenceman came close enough to speak without moving his mouth much. 2 miles ahead, patrol. The driver spat into the dust. Bridge? Watched. Creek? Low enough. The conversation lasted less than 20 seconds. Then the driver climbed back up and turned the wagon off the road before the patrol could ever see it. Under the straw, Mabel closed her eyes, not in relief. Relief was premature. But she understood that Amara's sacrifice had entered the hands of strangers now. The escape was no longer only mother and daughter. It had become a chain of people refusing to let the hunt finish. Near dusk, the wagon stopped in a wooded hollow. The driver lifted the false straw layer. Out. The children emerged stiff and blinking. The toddler was awake but quiet. The limping boy's bandage had darkened with dirt. The oldest girl helped him stand without being told. Mabel looked at the driver. "Where now?" He pointed to a footpath where two women waited under the trees. "They'll take you to the next house. After that, you don't travel together." Mabel looked at the children. 6 faces turned toward her. The next cruelty of survival arrived: separation. To keep them alive, they could not remain one visible group. 2 children would go east with one woman, 3 would go north with another. Mabel would take the toddler and follow later under a different name. The children understood before anyone explained. That was the theft within the rescue. Even freedom demanded more losses from them. The smallest girl began to shake her head. Mabel knelt in front of her. "You remember what Amara taught you?" The girl's eyes filled, but she nodded. "Step where?" "Stone when there's stone," the girl whispered. "Water when there's water." The girl swallowed. "Don't break branches." Mabel held her face for 1 second. "And don't look back unless someone falls." The girl nodded again. Mabel wanted to promise reunion. She did not. False promises were another kind of betrayal. Instead, she said, "You keep living until I find you." That was the most honest vow she could make. At the plantation, night came with no recovery. Crow sat in the front room with a glass untouched beside him. Wren stood near the door. Rusk had been kept outside, not dismissed, not trusted. He had seen too much and said too much. Crow's voice was low. "You had dogs." Wren said nothing. "You had men." Still nothing. "You brought back one girl." Wren's jaw tightened. Crow turned the glass once on the table. "One girl who cannot bring back the others." There it was. Not sorrow. Not moral horror. Loss assessed as failure of retrieval. Wren said, "Give it time." Crow looked at him. Time is what she took. Neither man spoke after that. The accusation had finally found the correct subject. In the smokehouse, Amara heard footsteps outside, but no urgent shouting. No horses leaving in a rush. No dogs pulled from their rest. The plantation had the sound of men extending a search they no longer believed they controlled. She understood then. Not fully. She could not know the exact road. She could not know the wagon. She could not know which children had been separated or where her mother slept. But she knew enough. The hunt had not returned with them. That meant the plan had survived the first day after capture. She leaned her head back against the wall. The room was hot, close, and dark. Smoke lived in the wood from years of use. The floor smelled of dirt and old salt. Her body demanded sleep, but pain kept waking her before she could fall completely under. Near midnight, a sound came at the small window. Not a voice, a pebble. Then another. Amara opened her eyes. The window was high, too narrow for escape, but not too high for a message. A small hand appeared briefly at the edge, not reaching in. Just placing something on the sill before vanishing. Amara waited. Footsteps outside continued past the door. A guard coughed. Silence returned. She stood slowly, using the wall to lift herself, and reached for the sill. Her fingers found a small piece of cloth tied around a sliver of wood. She pulled it down and held it close. No writing. Writing could condemn the carrier. Instead, the cloth held 3 knots. Amara stared at them in the dark. This was Mabel's old signal from the wash lines. 3 knots meant crossed water, not safe. Not finished. Not free. Crossed water. Amara closed her hand around the cloth and sat back down before the guard could hear movement. For the first time, her face changed. Not into joy. Joy would be too simple for what remained. But the terrible tightness in her eyes loosened. The body that had been used as bait had received proof that the bait had worked. She held the knots against her chest. Outside, the plantation slept badly. Inside, Amara counted the knots again. 1 for the river, 1 for the children, 1 for the mother who had not come back. By morning, Crow would still own the house. Wren would still hold the keys. The bell would still ring. The fields would still fill with people forced to labor under threat. Nothing had been overthrown in a single night. That is not how this history usually moved. It moved in fractures, in stolen hours, in roots made from memory, in children taught to step lightly, in mothers who kept walking while their hearts stayed behind, in daughters who understood the trap and entered it first, so others would not be dragged into it later. Amara did not escape that night. That is the part that must not be softened. She remained behind the barred door. She remained within reach of the men who wanted to turn her back into a warning. Her future was uncertain, and uncertainty is part of the wound. But Crow's plan had failed in the place it mattered most. He wanted the daughter captured so the mother would return. He captured the daughter too late. Mabel did not return. The children did not return. The trail did not return. And the story, once spoken in the yard, would not return to silence. By sunrise, Crow ordered the search continued for appearance. Riders left again. Notices would travel. Patrols would be warned. Men would pretend the world could still be narrowed around the missing, but everyone on the plantation understood what had happened. They had watched armed men drag Amara back in chains. They had also watched those same men fail to bring back everyone she loved. That contradiction became the hidden record, not written on paper, not entered in any owner's account. Carried instead in memory, in whispers, in the way people looked toward the western tree line and understood that a girl had walked into a hunt with no intention of saving herself first. They caught Amara at sunrise, but by then everyone she loved had already disappeared into freedom. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more hidden stories of survival, sacrifice, and resistance. And comment your city, state, or country below. I want to know where you're listening from. Also tell me your theory. Did Amara survive after they brought her back? Or did her mother return one day to finish what her daughter started?